What film or series lit your fuse and made you have to tell stories on screen?
Well, as far as TV is concerned, it was for me Night Gallery because I was a little late for the Twilight Zone. Night Gallery was more my generation, and I loved Rod Serling's humanism, but with a dash of horror rather than sci-fi. I really enjoyed the more fantastic elements. It was not huge production value, but they were doing risky stories, and I enjoyed the combination of the notion of humanism and brutality. I really enjoyed that, and an anime like Astro Boy, Osamu Tezuka's Astro Boy, which is a version of Pinocchio. But as a TV series, you had a long arc, and there was in Tezuka a lot of drama and darkness and sort of the marriage of the profound and the fun. Those were formative as far as television was concerned for me. And movies is more complicated because I think my fuse got lit in childhood by a double combo of Pinocchio and Frankenstein, which I saw very short one after the other, and they fused in my mind very much so. I thought they were very pertinent to my own biography. I thought I'm a mixture of Pinocchio and Frankenstein. I felt like an oddity, and I felt they were deeply expressive in ways that were beyond the genre they were supposed to be or what they were supposed to be function as. Like Frankenstein, I found it to be very moving and sweet and full of sort of existential tenderness. And Pinocchio, I think, was really scary, and I thought it captured how scary childhood felt. And then as a young filmmaker, 2 or 3 movies made me very aware that this was a profession in which you could do art, or you could tell stories that mattered very deeply. The 2 that immediately popped to mind were, for me, Duel, Spielberg's Duel, and Taxi Driver. I saw Marty's movie when I was a teenager, and I felt it was this very existential sort of feeling of loneliness. And if you can see a line now, Pinocchio, Frankenstein, or Taxi Driver is about entities that exist in isolation. I'm starting to see a through line there. And Taxi Driver may not be related to Duel. Well, there's vehicles, but it's also Duel becomes a primal story of a man alone. The main character is called David Mann with a double N. It was written by Richard Matheson, who I knew back then, even as a young reader. I knew his name. I had read I Am Legend, Incredible Shrinking Man, and Matheson tends to favor these stories of a man alone standing against impossible odds. So there's a through line between the 4, if you can see it. And there is, in all these movies, there is a combination of humanism and despair.
Well, now, so obviously you hold the original Pinocchio with a good deal of reverence. So
Yes.
what burned in you to want to tell your own version of that story, which is very different from the one that many people know who've watched the Disney classic?
That was the idea. The idea was that there is a version that is almost counter to the original version. It is enthroning disobedience rather than obedience, and the idea that you don't have to change to be loved. I was hoping not only to do a new version of a tale that started with Carlo Collodi, but to actually, in many ways, make it counter and make it a real father and son story in which we follow the father, even more importantly than the son, and I wanted to see the father learn to be a real father rather than the child learn to be a real child, which I found really, even as a kid, it robbed me in a way that felt wrong. I thought, well, isn't the parenting position the one that needs the learning, and I felt that it could be completely be transformed by the context of this and the historical context, and find a more, again, existential truth. What happens happens, and then we're gone. That showed how precious it is to be human and how brief it is to be human. So it was a completely different intention on the basic beats of the tale.
Well, now, is there, in both Pinocchio and Frankenstein, these are kind of father-son tales when you really kind of break it down. And so were there elements, even with your relationship with your dad, that that you were trying to discover things and maybe unearth things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the puzzle for me as a kid was my parents, and therefore, because I had to figure myself out, and I didn't have a manual to figure out the world, and the things that the adults told me were true and the world told me were true were different, and I had to reconcile them through fantasy. And I found Frankenstein and Pinocchio to be very moving in that way, because they were journeys into discovering your place in the world and the values of the world, ethically or spiritually. And I thought really those similarities illuminated my own sort of search for an identity. So yes, and I think the Pinocchio that we ended up making had to happen after I reconciled my relationship as a son with my father and my relationship as a father, and the ways that, as the movie says, imperfect fathers and imperfect sons are allowed to meet in the middle thanks to love and forgiveness, to forgive each other for being imperfect, to allow the humanity to sort of overcome our differences. That was the idea. And that's what structured the final shape.
Well, now, so on your way up, when you were finding your way as a filmmaker, a writer, director, what movie or series did you watch that came along and it was so good it made you think, oh, what am I doing? I'm never going to be able to do that.
Everybody you admire, you admire because you identify with, but you aspire to. I don't think anyone cannot admire somebody like Hitchcock or Orson Welles, or Capra or Wyler, or many, Buñuel in Mexico. Buñuel was very formative to me because his movie, which I think in America is called The Young and the Damned, Los Olvidados, I saw it and I thought, oh, I can tell stories about Mexico in a way that allows surrealism and fantastic imagery to coexist with a brutal reality. And that was very formative to me. And I always thought, you can never get as good as Buñuel. You can never get as good as Fellini, Bergman, or the masters. But you can certainly feel protected by the promise that it can be done. And I wish my life had gone in a different direction sometimes. I wish I could have done movies more in Mexico than in the international arenas, because I had so much hunger to tell middle-class Mexican stories mixed with the genre, But the kidnapping of my dad broke all that around 98. So I had to leave the country for the safety of my own family. And I will always keep guessing, but Buñuel was key. And I find a kinship between Buñuel and Hitchcock, a profound difference, but also profound similarities. And those are two filmmakers I tried to study as a young director and a young critic. I liked, and to this day, I like to talk about film so much. I mean, I thought to try to break down Buñuel and Hitchcock into elements that I could transmit or digest and pass on to others was very useful. So I used to teach, or I taught for a few years, film language in the film school that we had founded in Guadalajara, and I used Buñuel and Hitchcock quite a bit.
Well, now, so whether it was the success of something you did or the approval from someone whose opinion really mattered to you, what first gave you the confidence that, in fact, you should be doing this and you could belong?
Well, I was doing it before I realized it. I was doing Super 8s very naturally because my father had a camera. So I was making little movies already. And I remember I was 16, 17, and I was thinking I better hurry because Spielberg did Duel in his early 20s, you know? And I felt, I remember at 26, I felt like a has-been because I had not yet made Kronos. And I was like, I'm already late, you know? You always have this fantasy that you can do it earlier than you really should. And what I found out is you gain some competence with short films and with TV, which is what I did. And then you realize you're completely unprepared for your first feature. It's a completely different set of rules. It's the difference between a sprint and a marathon. And the sort of qualities that are required to ebb and flow and chase the rhythm and the flow of a movie in a short film are very different than a feature. But I think the encouragement came slow, and it came from making shorts that were well received, you know, or reasonably well received, and doing a few TV programs, directing and writing that gave you a measure of experience, you know, and before you realize it, you're making a first feature, you know.
Well, and now last question. What would you say was the biggest obstacle that you had to overcome to allow you to turn the projects that influenced you into your own language as a filmmaker?
I think you do that from the start. Like you would dissect a film, or I always thought films were text, and if you want to write, you should learn to read film. So I would watch the way people blocked, John Schlesinger, Steven Spielberg. Their blocking is so pristine. You know, you can see the master and the cuts, and you can sort of say, oh, this is the way they dealt with the master, and this is the way they covered it, and this is very precise. Hitchcock, incredibly precise, mathematically precise in his blocking. And, you never try to do what they do. I don't think so. I think that's impossible because that's their voice. You don't want to... I mean, it was easier for me in horror to try, for example, to emulate the color of Mario Bava. I would do very saturated color gels in my short films, and I was thinking I was doing Mario Bava-esque light and stuff like that, but I knew I was just trying to practice. But, to learn to cut between moving shots, or when do you stop moving the camera and when do you need to push in. If you think about the vocabulary of film, you have about 12 options, and then the multiplications between those 12 options are infinite. Think about how many musical notes there are. There's very few of them, but music is infinite because you conjugate this little alphabet or this vocabulary into an infinite number of possibilities. So let's think about it. You move the camera towards the subject or away from the subject, or the subject moves towards the lens or away from the lens. You rise or you jib down. Do you go up or do you go down? Are you using a long lens or a short lens? Are you blah, blah, blah? There's only a finite number of choices. Do you follow or do you lead? And you practice with every shot. We would try to practice 1, 2, or 3 of these things and say, I'm going to get, for example, I would say, I'm going to get a jump cut really clean in this middle of this action on a Super 8, So you practice that and your vocabulary becomes your own, because it's like practicing as a writer cursive or practicing italics or underline or bold. It's a typography, it's a typographic practice. It's not a stylistic practice. Style will come from you.
One one last thing. I once interviewed Ridley Scott, and he told me that really, since the beginning, he could read a script and see in his mind exactly how visually he would shoot that movie. So he said that's his strength, and what he had to do was find out how to tell good stories and make sure that the stories he were telling were really good. What would you say is your strength, the thing that you bring to the table that makes you so singular?
Well, listen, it's hard to see your own strengths, but I think tone is a really difficult thing. And when you combine tonal as asymmetry, is really hard. Like I can go from drama to comedy to horror to different registers in the octaves of the movie, and I can combine a fairy tale with a war film, with a melodrama, with a I think that's a thing that comes naturally to me. I wouldn't say it's a strength or a virtue, because that is for others to judge. And normally your virtues are your defects. People like you, and they like you for that. And the people that dislike you most of the time for the same reasons. It's the difference between a beauty mark and a mole. It's just the eye of the beholder, So, but I can say the fluidity between tones and making it sort of cohesive. The fact that a movie can go from fun to sad to heart-wrenching to terrifying or to disturbing is sort of a thing I kind of do. And the other thing that I seem to navigate rather naturally is the creation of visual worlds, the universes that feel visually of a piece, if you would. Those are things that I feel very much at home with. And I write screenplays or read screenplays, and the solutions instinctively come visually very easy. What is the gulf is between, and it only comes with experience, between your knowledge of the tools and your expressive intention. In other words, the difference between a camera underslung on a crane or overslung on a crane and the lens you put on it, and if you're on a jib or you're on a techno or you're on a little dolly with a scissor lift, the difference in the vocabulary in the way you execute that shot is immense, but it only comes with practice.